Debate, the Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm very happy to be here today to speak on Bill C-235, an act respecting the building of a green economy in the prairies. And I want to thank the member from Winnipeg South Centre for bringing this forward. And as a person who lives on the coast, I, of course, don't have the experience of living in the Prairie region, but I do connect to this very important issue because I live and have grown up my whole life in more rural and remote communities, and I recognize that when you live in those environments, there's a very different way of being in the world. We're a lot more connected to our communities. We often have a harder time getting to other places. I really appreciated the member talking about flying places and then having to wait many hours. I know that when I come here often, I get to fly to one part of the country, wait a few hours before I can get to this part of the country. And that is just the reality that we experience, and one that I think we all know we need to do better, especially when we're thinking about how we're going to make sure that those spaces are more accessible and make sure that they're part of our communities across the planet, across this country, and that they have an economic viability that can sometimes be a challenge for more rural and remote communities. So this particular bill talks a lot about how to bring people together, how to have them talk about how we can see more of a green economy. And it's something that I really believe in. And I think that when we stand in a place like this, where we represent collectively the whole country, the stories of each of our regions are unique, and yet there is a common ground. And especially when we talk about rural and remote communities, we know that they often go through a cycle of boom and bust. That one moment it's very well, the economy is going strong, people are doing well, and then it changes quickly. And although it is these communities that have built this country, those resources, those people have given so much in taxes and in resources to this country that often a lot of the urban centers are built on the labor of more rural and remote communities. They're not included in a way that is meaningful. So I know in the last Parliament, I was happy to table a motion, Motion 53, on the principles for sustainable and equitable future. And it talks specifically about having solutions locally that really looked at what the resources were, what our skill set is, and how we're going to make ourselves more sustainable in rural communities so that we can have a more stable economy, but also address the issue of climate change, because we are in an emergency and things are changing very rapidly. And as we do the work that we must do, and I can argue a later day about what I think this government is doing, because I have to say, quite frankly, we're not moving in the direction that I would like to see us move. We're pushing really hard to get some of those actions, because when it comes to emissions, when it comes to actually addressing climate change, I think we have a lot more proactive work to be doing. But part of that conversation has to be looking at these communities, looking at communities in the prairies, looking at rural and remote parts of Canada, and saying what is sustainable in those communities? What are the skill sets in those communities? How do we bring people together? And that is what this bill is saying. How do we bring all those different voices together to make sure that there's meaningful solutions going forward? You know, in my last job, I worked with newcomers to Canada. And one of the things that I found really interesting was the amount of research that has happened in Canada, but also, in fact, across the whole planet, on how to create the best solutions. And they say again and again, the more diversity you have at the table, the more people with different opinions that you have at the table, and you actually work through it. So it takes longer, there's no doubt. When you're trying to figure out how to get from here to here, and you have a lot of people around that table with differing opinions, it's going to take longer to get to that. But the research has proven repeatedly that once you get there, even though it takes longer, the other side of that is a lot more coordinated, the solutions are a lot more innovative, and they are long-lasting. So it is something that we should be looking at and addressing, and that was what my motion talked about. How do we bring people together? How do we look at a regional approach when we look at what's happening in our environment, when we look at the challenges and concerns around stable employment? How do we not fight against each other, but come together and create solutions that are going to make sense, that are going to make sure that there's good jobs in our region, but also address the climate crisis in a meaningful way? We have to do that work, and we have to do it with an urgency. So I appreciated this member talking about making that timeline shorter. And I think I'm going to quote the member in his speech. He said, "The pace of change is too slow." And I agree. When we're looking at the challenges that we're facing today, we can't wait. We can't sit here in this place and have big discussions. We need to give resources to local regions and communities and say, you are the experts in your area. You tell us. Here's the criteria. You tell us the next steps that you're going to take. So the NDP will be supporting this because I think it's important to look at those solutions, to look at local responses, and to look at regional responses because they really can profoundly make a difference. You know, I think about the fact that when I look at my area, we see a lot of things being ripped out of the earth in one way or another and being shipped off somewhere else, often outside of the country, to be changed into something, sent back to us, and then we buy it. And I'm really concerned about that. You know, when I think about local solutions, when I look at the environmental crisis that we're in, we need to see more value-added production in our communities, in our regions. This is something that I think this bill will touch on, and I hope that every person in this place will take it under consideration, because if we don't start seeing more of that, production with our own resources in our own country, we're going to continue to see wealth be here for a short time and not stay here permanently. And I also want to just mention, you know, last week, I should say, last Friday, I was in Powell River, where regionally a lot of people came together to talk about the housing crisis that we're experiencing right now. And of course, inside of that issue, like every issue, I think, across this country, the climate crisis was brought up. You know, people without homes having to live on the streets, what it means when we're having incredible, unpredictable weather, and how do we deal with these issues. And we also talked a lot about the vulnerability of seniors who live in our region, which usually doesn't get very hot, but we're seeing this huge increase of heat. And then during the winter, high cost of energy for people to stay warm and what that means for folks. And I think of Cortez Island, a small community in my riding, 2 ferries away from where I live. And that community is working together. They're actually fundraising. They have a high level of poverty in their senior population so that they can all have heat pumps. So the community itself is recognizing this huge challenge, and they're collectively working together to deal with the climate crisis, but also honor and respect the seniors in their communities by trying to find a solution. So, you know, I think that in closing, Madam Speaker, we have to recognize the dynamic approach of our smaller communities. We have to work with them so that they have more opportunities, and we have to understand that the federal government has a very important role, but sometimes their important role is to make sure the resources are there so that the local communities can do the work that needs to be done. And that, I can't say enough about that. When I look at economic development, when I look at addressing climate crisis, we need to see those communities recognized, honored, and listened to. And sometimes bringing them together is really going to make a long-term difference so that we can get to a solution that we can sustain. Thank you.